the spring that changed everything. The dust hung in the air like a shroud over the Broken Arrow Ranch, and Thomas McKenna stood on his front porch, watching his prize Angus cattle cluster around the bone-dry water troughs. Their flanks were sunken, their eyes dull with thirst. The drought had stretched on for 7 weeks now, the worst he'd seen in his 43 years of ranching. Even the deep well that had served his family for 3 generations had finally run dry 2 days ago. Thomas removed his weathered Stetson and ran a calloused hand through his graying hair. The bank was breathing down his neck, threatening foreclosure if he couldn't make the next payment. Without water, his cattle would die, and with them any hope of saving the ranch that had been in the McKenna family since. He was about to head back inside when he spotted a figure walking up the dusty road. The midday sun created a wavering mirage, making it difficult to make out who it was. As the person drew closer, Thomas felt his jaw tighten with recognition. It was Miguel Santos, the boy he'd run off his property just 3 years ago. Miguel approached the fence line but didn't cross onto McKenna property. He was no longer the scrawny 17-year-old Thomas remembered. At 20, he'd filled out, his shoulders broad from hard work, his face weathered by sun and wind. He wore simple clothes, faded jeans, a work shirt, and boots that had seen better days. "Mr. McKenna," Miguel called out, his voice respectful despite everything that had passed between them. Thomas descended the porch steps slowly, his boots crunching on the parched earth. He stopped several feet from the fence, his arms crossed. "What do you want, Santos?" Miguel's dark eyes met his steadily. "I heard about your water troubles, about the cattle. News travels fast." Thomas's voice was cold. "Don't see how that concerns you. I might be able to help." Thomas let out a harsh laugh. "Help? You're about the last person I'd accept help from." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. 3 years ago, Miguel had come to the ranch looking for work. He'd been desperate, his family facing eviction from their small trailer on the outskirts of town. Thomas had taken one look at the boy's worn clothes, at his Mexican features, and decided he didn't want his kind working on his ranch. He'd made it clear that Miguel wasn't welcome, using words that still sometimes echoed in his mind during sleepless nights. Miguel nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "I understand why you'd feel that way, but your cattle don't deserve to suffer because of what's between us. My cattle are my business." "Yes, sir, they are." Miguel shifted his weight, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. "But I know where there's water on your land, fresh water. Enough for your whole herd." Thomas felt a spark of hope, quickly smothered by suspicion. "That's impossible. I know every inch of this ranch. There's no water left." "There is. Deep underground. I can find it." "You?" Thomas scoffed. "What would a punk kid like you know about finding water?" Miguel's expression remained calm despite the insult. "My grandfather taught me the old ways. How to read the land, feel where the water flows beneath the surface. I've found springs on 3 ranches in the past year." Thomas had heard rumors about a young man who seemed to have an uncanny ability to locate underground water sources, but he'd never connected it to Miguel Santos. The stories seemed too fantastical to believe, tales of a dowser who could divine water where others had failed. "Even if that were true," Thomas said, his voice hard, "why would you want to help me? After what He stopped himself, unable to voice the cruel words he'd spoken 3 years ago. Miguel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the cattle gathered around the empty trough. "Because they're thirsty," he said simply, "and because holding on to anger is like carrying stones in your pocket. Eventually they weigh you down so much you can't move forward." The simple wisdom in the young man's words hit Thomas unexpectedly hard. He thought of his own anger, the prejudices he'd carried for so long they'd become part of him like old scars. "What would you want in return?" Thomas asked, his business instincts overriding his pride. "Nothing. Just the chance to help." Thomas stared at him, searching for some hidden motive, some angle he couldn't see. But Miguel's eyes held only honest concern for the suffering animals. "You're telling me you'd work for free? After the way I treated you?" "Yes." The 2 men stood in silence, the weight of the past and the desperate present pressing down on them. Finally, Thomas's love for his animals overcame his stubborn pride. "If you're lying to me, if this is some kind of game, it's not a game, Mr. McKenna. Your cattle don't have much time left." Thomas looked back at his herd. Some of the older animals were already showing signs of severe dehydration. In another day or two he'd start losing them. The thought of watching them die because of his own prejudice was unbearable. "All right," he said finally, "show me this water." Miguel climbed over the fence with fluid grace, and Thomas felt a pang of discomfort at having the young man on his property again. But as they walked across the dusty field, he noticed how Miguel moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the landscape with an intensity that spoke of genuine knowledge. They walked for nearly an hour, moving through different sections of the ranch. Miguel would occasionally stop, close his eyes, and stand perfectly still for several minutes. Sometimes he would kneel and place his hands flat on the ground, as if listening to something only he could hear. "This is nonsense," Thomas muttered after the fourth such stop. Miguel opened his eyes and looked at him. "My grandfather could find water anywhere," said. "The earth speaks to those who know how to listen. I know it sounds crazy to you. It does, but you're still following me." Thomas didn't have an answer for that. They continued walking until they reached a slight depression in the land, shaded by a cluster of old mesquite trees. Thomas had always thought of this area as just another useless patch of scrubland. Miguel knelt in the center of the depression and placed both hands on the ground. He closed his eyes and remained motionless for several minutes. Thomas was about to voice his impatience when Miguel opened his eyes and smiled. "Here," he said with quiet confidence, 15 feet down. Good clean water." Thomas looked around skeptically. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir, but you'll need to dig to find out." The next challenge was equipment. Thomas's old well-digging machinery had broken down months ago, and he couldn't afford to hire a professional crew. Miguel suggested they start with hand tools and see what they could accomplish. For the next 3 days the two men worked under the blazing sun. Miguel showed up at dawn each morning, carrying water bottles and simple tools. They took turns with the pickaxe and shovel, slowly breaking through the hard pan clay and rock. Thomas watched Miguel work with growing respect. The young man never complained, never slacked off, despite receiving no payment for his labor. His shirt was soon soaked with sweat, his hands blistered, but he continued digging with unwavering determination. On the second day, as they shared a meager lunch in the shade of the mesquite trees, Thomas found himself studying Miguel's profile. "Why did you really come back?" he asked suddenly. Miguel paused in eating his sandwich. "I told you, the cattle need water. That's not the whole truth." Miguel was quiet for a long moment. "My family lost our place that winter. After you turned me away, I couldn't find work anywhere in time. We had to move to the city, live with relatives." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. "I'm sorry to hear that. It worked out in the end. I found other work, learned new skills, but I always wondered what would have happened if." He shrugged. "Doesn't matter now, but it did matter, and Thomas knew it. His thoughtless cruelty had affected real people, changed the course of life." The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a heavy yoke. "I shouldn't have," he began, then stopped. The words felt inadequate. Miguel looked at him with understanding in his dark eyes. "We all make mistakes, Mr. McKenna. The measure of a man isn't whether he stumbles, but whether he gets back up." That afternoon, they hit water. It started as a dark stain in the clay at the bottom of their hole, then a trickle, growing stronger with each shovelful they removed. Within an hour, clear, cold water was bubbling up from the ground, filling the bottom of their makeshift well. Thomas knelt at the edge and cupped the water in his hands, tasting it. It was sweet and clean, better than any water he'd ever drawn from his old well. "I'll be damned," he whispered. Miguel smiled, his face streaked with mud and sweat. "Told you the earth would provide." Working together, they rigged a temporary pump and ran a hose to the nearest water trough. As the first clear stream of water began filling the container, Thomas's cattle caught the scent and came running. The sound of their eager drinking was the sweetest music Thomas had ever heard. Over the next few days, they worked to properly develop the spring, building a stone-lined basin and installing a permanent pumping system. Miguel's knowledge proved invaluable at every step. He seemed to understand not just how to find water, but how to work with it, how to create a sustainable source that would serve the ranch for years to come. As they worked, Thomas learned that Miguel had spent the past 3 years working construction in the city, sending most of his earnings back to help his family. He'd learned about well digging and water systems, preparing for the day when he could return to rural work. His dream was to start his own ranch someday, though he admitted it seemed impossible without capital. Thomas found himself genuinely enjoying the young man's company. Miguel was intelligent, hard-working, and possessed a deep understanding of the land that came from growing up in. More than that, he had a generous spirit that hadn't been broken by hardship or unfair treatment. On the 5th day, as they put the finishing touches on the spring system, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. "I've got a proposition for you," he said as they cleaned their tools. Miguel looked up expectantly. "I need help running this ranch. The drought showed me I can't do it all alone anymore. I'm offering you a job, full-time, fair wages, and a share of the profits when we sell cattle." Miguel's expression was carefully neutral. "Are you sure about that, Mr. McKenna? People in town might talk." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Let them talk. I'm tired of caring what small-minded people think. Besides, I've seen what kind of man you are. That's what matters." A slow smile spread across Miguel's face. "I'd be honored to work for you." "With me," Thomas corrected. "Partners, if you're willing." They shook hands over the bubbling spring, sealing an agreement that would change both their lives. The transformation of the Broken Arrow Ranch was remarkable. With Miguel's help, Thomas implemented water conservation techniques and more efficient grazing patterns. The new spring provided abundant water not just for the cattle, but for irrigating a small but productive vegetable garden that Miguel suggested they plant. Miguel moved into the small foreman's cabin on the property, and his presence brought new energy to the ranch. He had ideas for diversifying their income, raising sheep, growing hay for sale to neighboring ranches, even offering his water-finding services to other desperate ranchers in the region. The partnership prospered. Within a year, they'd not only saved the ranch from foreclosure but had turned it into one of the most successful operations in the county. The spring that Miguel had found never ran dry, even during a second drought the following summer. More importantly, the two men had forged a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Thomas discovered that his former prejudices had blinded him to the richness that diversity could bring to his life. Miguel's different perspective, his connection to the land through his grandfather's teachings, his innovative ideas, all of these had made the ranch stronger. The townspeople did talk, as Miguel had predicted. Some couldn't understand how Thomas McKenna, known for his harsh judgments and closed mind, had changed so dramatically, but most recognized the success of the partnership and the obvious mutual respect between the two men. Thomas's sister visited from back east, and was amazed by the transformation she saw not just in the ranch, but in her brother. "You seem different, Tom," she said as they sat on the porch watching Miguel work with a new colt in the corral. "Happier, more at peace." Thomas nodded, thinking of the journey that had brought him to this point. "I learned something important. When you build walls to keep people out, you end up trapping yourself inside them." 2 years after Miguel had first returned to dig the spring, the ranch was thriving beyond Thomas's wildest dreams. They'd expanded their herd, improved their facilities, and established the Broken Arrow as a model of sustainable ranching practice. One evening, as they sat by the spring after a long day's work, Miguel brought up something that had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about my grandfather lately," he said, trailing his fingers in the clear water. "About the stories he used to tell me." "What kind of story?" "About second chances. He used to say that sometimes the earth has to crack before something new can grow. That water finds a way to rise, even through solid rock, if the pressure is great enough." Thomas considered this. "Sounds like he was a wise man." "He was. I think he would have liked you, Mr. McKenna, the man you've become." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the gentle bubbling of the spring and the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas thought about the drought that had brought them together, about the desperation that had forced him to swallow his pride and accept help from someone he'd wronged. "Miguel," he said finally, "I need to tell you something. What I said to you that day 3 years ago, the way I treated you, there's no excuse for it. I was wrong and I'm sorry." Miguel nodded slowly. I know you are. I've seen it in how you've changed, in how you treat everyone now. That means more than words, still needed to be said. Yes, it did. As the stars came out overhead, Thomas reflected on the strange turns life could take. A drought that had threatened to destroy everything he'd worked for had instead led him to discover something more valuable than water. The understanding that strength came not from building walls but from opening doors. The spring continued to flow, a constant reminder that beneath the surface of even the most barren-looking ground, life-giving water could be found by those willing to dig deep enough. And sometimes Thomas had learned, the people you need most in your life are the ones you've pushed away, waiting patiently for the moment when pride gives way to wisdom, and walls crumble to reveal the springs of humanity that flow beneath. The Broken Arrow Ranch had been saved not just by water, but by the courage to admit wrong, the willingness to change, and the recognition that redemption often comes through the hands of those we've least reason to expect forgiveness from. In finding water, they had found something far more precious. They had found their way back to what it truly means to be human.